This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you very much, Chris, for a carefully selected bio. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me. And it really was a great day yesterday. A series of exciting and very professional papers. And today you'll begin with a very amateur paper because my expertise is not in reception. I'm getting involved in reception, as everybody to some extent now is. And a recent paper on Tam O'Shanter and Robert Burns's knowledge of Virgil Georgics is another of the ways that I'm trying to bring together my interests in classical Greek and Latin literature to my origins in Scotland. This is no more than a very preliminary exploration of what is a large field. It's a field I think nobody has gone into, but in this room there may be people who know more than I do and who will tell me that there's a monograph somewhere that tells me all the answers. But I don't know of it, and I urge somebody to write it. I begin with item 1 on the handout, a fictitious scene, my little attempt to be a Plutarchian writer of anecdotes. What you have at item 1 in handout is not my fictitious bit of Plutarch, that's a real bit of Plutarch. My fictitious anecdote would be about the man here mentioned, Demetrius of Tarsus, who was sent off to Britain to explore the periphery of the British Isles with imperial encouragement and support early in the 80s AD. He must have passed very near my native village if he was coming in the train of Agricola, which he may or may not have been. And in my fictitious scene, he interviews the Scot Galgacus before the Battle of Mons Graupius. And Galgacus asks, who is the wisest of the Greeks? Which any Celt would want to know. And Demetrius replies, Plutarch, who will shortly be my host at a dialogue in Delphi. And it is the De Defectu Oracolorum, from which I take passage 1, that indeed involves Demetrius in Delphi. And makes reference to that trip that isn't fictitious because we've now, for 100 years, since the building of York railway station in the later 19th century, had a couple of dedications precisely by Demetrius, which I didn't put on the handout, but they're readily available in the Roman inscriptions of Britain. But there is now a big gap. I know nothing of Plutarch in Scotland before the 15th and 16th centuries, and there my findings are very dependent upon the labours of John Durcan and Anthony Ross, who did a marvellous catalogue of printed books in the libraries of Scotland between 1470 and 1560 about. Now, of some 1,000 known volumes in that catalogue, with some 300 owners, only a very small number are editions of Plutarch, but there are editions of Plutarch. The 3 individuals whom Durcan and Ross register as owning works of Plutarch are my items 2, 3, and 4. Henry Sinclair, who owned an opera and an opuscula. Opuscula, certainly the Moralia, maybe the opera, both categories of writing. Galloway, my number 3, who owned an opuscula printed in Paris in 1526, now in New College, that is of course New College Edinburgh, not New College in any other institution. And William Chisholm II, who had a copy of Ameo's translation of the Lives, and that is now in Inner Peffrey, Perthshire, and I shall return to that shortly. I'll linger a little on these 3 people. I think if we're working in a Plutarchian environment, we would want to be biographic to a certain extent, and I shall indulge myself in a Plutarchian way. So back to Henry Sinclair, my number 2, who reappears as my number 5. He's the most learned and best documented of these three people, born 1508, died 1565. He studied at St. Leonard's College, St. Andrews. He was appointed Lord of Session at the tender age of 29 in 1537, and then in 1541 was named Abbot of the Abbot of Kilwinning in Ayrshire, an office that he exchanged by a procedure I don't fully understand for the office of Dean of Glasgow in 1550. It's rather like Plutarch moving from Cairo to Athens, I suppose. He was the negotiator of a peace treaty between Flanders and Scotland in 1548, that he was politically involved. And then between 1550 and 1554, he was in France. And if you note the list of his volumes, you can see that he is buying books that were published in Paris up to 1554. And then we don't have later books from Parisian presses. In 1558, he was appointed president of the Court of Session and Bishop of Ross, way up in the north. That must have taken him out of his humanistic tread if he actually went there. And indeed, he was only consecrated bishop a little after being appointed. Then in 1561, he became a member of Mary, Queen of Scots' Privy Council of 12. The other members were all laymen. He was the only churchman in that group. Denounced by John Knox, he maintained neutral religious attitudes. He wrote legal works and additions to Bowie's History of Scotland. And he died in Paris, where he had gone for medical treatment on the 2nd of January 1565. And here is somebody who, we heard a lot about England, France and Italy yesterday. I didn't hear the word Scotland at all, but Scotland was part of this nexus of countries with shared humanistic activities in which, of course, Plutarch played his part. I have not yet discovered any manuscripts that were owned by Henry Sinclair. My guess is he must have had manuscripts. Durkin and Ross list 106 printed books attributable to his library. And of these, the other classical texts I list under item 5 on the handout. And you can see it's a very learned range. Alexander of Aphrodisias, Callimachus, Heliodorus. He's into the Greek novel before the 20th century revival of studies of the Greek novel. And Lycophron, reading Lycophron in Scotland in the 16th century. Pausanias, of course. Ptolemy, of course. Theophrastus, only one volume surviving, but presumably he had more. And of course, again, Xenophon. And more Greek texts and Latin texts. It is a formidable library for the middle of the 16th century, I think, outside an institution, a formidable individual's library. But I'm not an expert, and somebody may tell me, oh, this is just small beer, and I shall change my impression. On to Galloway, my second figure, item 6 on the handout. He was Canon of Aberdeen Cathedral, rector of Kinkell, where he rebuilt a church that is now in ruins, and he was also the architect of the first Bridge of Dee in Aberdeen. So he was again a Plutarchian sort of figure. He put his hand to local works, like Plutarch sorting out the drainage system in Cheironea. Galloway died in 1552, and the 22 books registered by Durkin and Ross include only 3 classical texts, the Plutarch, and then an Aristotle Politics and a Cicero. So a much more selective reader. My third here is number 7, Chisholm, William Chisholm II, appointed by Pius IV, coadjutor to his uncle, Bishop of Dunblane, in 1561, became bishop himself in 1564, and then he became, in 1570, Bishop of Vaison-la-Romaine in Provence. So the French connection is here important. His Plutarch is the only Greek work in the 9 printed books to survive and be catalogued by Durkin and Ross. The other 8 books in Durkin and Ross show he could read Latin and apparently Hebrew. He was spoken by John Knox as one of the chief pillars of the papistical kirk, which of course is a very savage criticism. So he was spoken likewise in the very highest terms by the Pope's legate Nicholas de Gouda in a dispatch from the Scottish court to the Vatican in 1562. He was much employed in diplomatic activity by Mary, Queen of Scots, and the most important of his missions perhaps was one in Rome in 1565 to get permission from the Pope for her marriage with Darnley, and then in 1567 he was sent as a special envoy to France to convey the news of Mary, Queen of Scots' marriage to Bothwell and to explain why this was happening. That must have been quite a taxing piece of work, and reading Plutarch wouldn't help all that much. He was also one of the commissioners for the divorce of Bothwell from Lady Jane Gordon. He is said to have still further dilapidated the income of his bishopric, to have declared to have forfeited it for non-compliance with the new arrangements after the fall of his royal mistress. So if you get involved in high politics, then you can fall pretty rapidly as well as rise. He went to Rome in exile in January 1569 and had himself appointed a priest at Santa Maria Maggiore by Carlo Borromeo. At one point he retired to France, and in 1570 he was instituted by the Pope to the bishopric of Vaison-la-Romaine, where he'd been earlier, as some sort of recompense for the loss of position in Scotland. He then resigned that bishopric in favour of his nephew, retired to the convent of the Grande Chartreuse, took the vows of a simple monk, but nevertheless was soon made prior of the Chartreuse at Lyon and eventually prior of the Charterhouse in Rome. He continued to busy himself with affairs until his death in Rome in September 1593, and is buried in Rome in the Carthusian Church. So again, we have somebody whose movements are the British Isles, in this case Scotland, and France, and Italy. A fourth man who also owned editions of Plutarch that are not included in Durkin and Ross is Scotland's greatest Renaissance scholar, George Buchanan, 1506 to 1582. I put some details on item 8 on the handout. And his gifts to Glasgow University in 1578 included a Lives and a Moralia. His other many Greek books included a Hermogenes and a Xenophon. And his epigrams included a translation of a Greek epigram, his number 1.45, which is transmitted only in Plutarch's Life of Demosthenes. I've given the reference in item 8 on the handout. He didn't get it from the anthology, he got it from Plutarch's Demosthenes. His Greek was very good. He did translations of Euripides' Medea and Alcestis, but it was not Plutarch but Livy that he read with Mary Queen of Scots. He was appointed her tutor in 1562. Maybe Mary Queen of Scots didn't have enough Greek to read Plutarch. I realize that's probably the reason. Later, when Buchanan was tutor to James VI, he did indeed read Plutarch with James, along with our Socrates and the New Testament, before breakfast. Then after breakfast, Livy and Cicero later in the day. I know from my own experience of teaching a king that it's better to divide the day into parts. And when I was doing this, I did Cicero at one part of the day and Caesar in another part of the day. But that's another story, quite irrelevant today. The evidence of his knowledge, Buchanan's knowledge of Plutarch, comes out in a couple of details which I've put down in numbers 9 and 10 on the handout. He refers to the De Fluminibus, which he thinks to be Plutarch, the canon does this in his Rerum Scoticarum Historia, completed in 1579, but only published after his death in 1582. And there you see the word dunum, which you had heard earlier in the magic name Dunblane, which is again being given international currency by Andrew Murray, whom everyone will want to favour in all circumstances, of course. I see certain doubts crossing minds of non-Scots. And then item 10 on the handout, which seems to have come from the life of Marius, on the term or the name, whether it is a name or not a name, Cimbri. Maybe if one read from cover to cover the surviving works, one would discover a bit more. But here is somebody who both knows and uses his Plutarch, uses Plutarch both in teaching and in his own writing. Another name in the Renaissance I want to spend a little time with is Henry Scrimger, item 11 on the handout, born in Dundee, which is what particularly attracts me to him, since I have a family connection with Dundee. Probably in 1505, and related to John Young, who was the father of Peter Young, later Royal Librarian to James VI, whose memoirs are of use in reconstructing humanistic history in this period. Scrimger first attended Dundee Grammar School, then went to St Salvator's College, St Andrews. He became a bachelor in 1533, won the first place in the examination for teaching the following year, and then proceeded to Paris, where he studied with Guillaume Boudet and Pierre Ramus. And the name Henricus Scrimger appears twice in the rector's register in 1538. Thereafter he went down to Bourges to study civil law for 4 years, and while in Bourges he formed acquaintance with Jacques Amiot. Must have been a quite young Jacques Amiot at that time. I haven't sorted out in my mind. People in this room must know the birth and death date of Amiot. And he succeeded Amiot in becoming preceptor to the sons of Guillaume Bochetel, the Secretary of State, probably for 4. Then in 1547, Scrimger returned to Scotland for a short stay, and Bochetel recommended him in a letter to Mary of Guise as an homme d'honnête vie, de vertu, de grand savoir, tant en lettres grecques que latines. I think the connection with Amiot makes it pretty certain that Scrimger came across Plutarch, though again this is a young Amiot, but I haven't any specific evidence for Scrimger knowing, far less using, Plutarch. It seems to me very likely that one of these humanists will have brought a Plutarch manuscript to Scotland, but I found no evidence that this was so. Certainly none is registered by Cunningham, 1982, which I've got in my bibliography. Hence it was only much later, in 1807, that a manuscript containing 18 lives, a poem by an anonymous author, and a poem of Agathias on the statue of Plutarch eventually reached Scotland, long after printed book culture had replaced manuscript culture. It is, however, an early, well, relatively early manuscript. It was copied in 1348. It has a translation of the epigram of Agathias by Victor Falconius, who had owned the manuscript on the 10th of November 1509, and then had belonged first to Aldicianus Parrhasius, who bequeathed it to Antonio Seripando. Later, in 1748, it became part of the library of César de Missy, and it was from his library that William Hunter acquired it and gave it to Glasgow, though it was retained in London for somebody else's use until that date in 1807 that it eventually reached the Hunterian Library in Glasgow. As far as I know, it has not been consulted by any of the editors of Plutarch's Lives, but I may be doing them an injustice. but somebody should look at it properly sometime. Well, I now move to a quite different sort of context. I move to the rolling fields of Strathern, familiar to anybody who's been to Crieff, for example, and strangely unfamiliar to some people who I think ought to know it better, because in Strathern there is a lending library which was set up in 1680 as the first free lending public library in Scotland, based on 400 books of the Drummond family, a family that is still represented in the area. And it's currently in the middle of nowhere because routes have changed. It's near a river crossing. It is no longer a river crossing. So you have to drive down the long farm track to get there. And it's maybe not surprising that people don't go there as often as they should to consult books and manuscripts. But they now have a web catalogue which can be consulted, and which I've used as a basis for an overlong entry in my handout, item 13, listing the Plutarchs. I note that I've said incorrectly that there are 15 Plutarchs. There are not. There are 10 Plutarchs, but one is in 6 volumes, and I was counting too hastily when I was writing that sentence. But it is quite remarkable, I think, that even if it is only 10 Plutarchs that there are in this collection of 400 books given by the Drummond family in 1680, it is remarkable what a high proportion is Plutarch. So perhaps if you were a gentleman farmer, a laird in Strathern in the 17th century, when the nights began to get short and you sat by the fire, it was Plutarch you decided to read. Well, I'm not going to linger further on the inner Peffery evidence, but I do commend people to look at the various editions that are there. They're mostly translations into French or Latin, but there are Greek texts as well. And I move on to the Scottish Enlightenment and artificially set out a period of roughly 1711 to 1798. That is, I take David Hume's birth around 1711 as a beginning and Gavin Hamilton's death 1798 at the end. Again, I'm going to be selective. I have 4 exhibits: David Hume, James Boswell, Adam Smith, and Gavin Hamilton. Rather different sorts of people. Hume, of course, well known internationally as a philosopher, perhaps less well known as a historian. He certainly knew some Plutarch, but perhaps in translation rather than in Greek, he occasionally used him. Thus, item 15 in the handout, in a quite well-known unsent letter of March or April 1734 to Dr. George Chain, in which he described his troubled state. He was a 23-year-old at the time, and 23-year-olds do have troubled states. Hume mentioned, I quote, having read many books of morality, such as Cicero, Seneca, and Plutarch. And then in an essay entitled The Skeptic, item 16, Hume suggests that the moral characters of those engaged in the practice of liberty are to be formed in part by reading Plutarch for learning, Cicero for eloquence, Lucian for imagination, Seneca for wit, Montaigne for gaiety, and Shaftesbury for the sublime. That's in itself an interesting collocation, worth an essay in itself. A discussion of Alexander in the treatise of 1739, seems to use on the fortune or virtue of Alexander. Another discussion seems to draw on Plutarch on progress and virtue. And an inquiry in, a passage in an inquiry concerning human understanding names Plutarch alongside Livy and Tacitus as a sound source for Roman history. But the Palmary quotation I put down on the handout, I couldn't resist putting it down, I can't resist reading it out, comes from an essay 6 of the study of history. I remember I was once desired by a young beauty for whom I had some passion, to send her some novels and romances for her amusement in the country. But I was not so ungenerous as take the advantage which such a course of reading might have given me, having resolved not to make use of poisoned arms against her. I therefore sent her Plutarch's Lives, assuring her at the same time that there was not a word of truth in them from beginning to end. She perused them very attentively till she came to the lives of Alexander and Caesar, whose names she had heard of by accident, and then returned me the book with many reproaches for deceiving her. Well, one had never thought of Plutarch's Lives as a chat-up line, but there you are. There are several other citations to be gleaned from the works of Hume, which I think I've got down somewhere like item 18 on the handout. I'm sorry, number 21 on the handout. So alongside Hume, a similarly tough thinker is Adam Smith, rather younger, baptized 1723, died 1790. It's perhaps not surprising that the focus of Smith's philosophical thinking seems to have led him to cite Plutarch less often than Hume did, and as a student of philosophy at Glasgow and then at Balliol College, Oxford, he may have had little reason to read him in his early years as a student. Nevertheless, casual remarks do suggest some knowledge. For example, in Wealth of Nations, Smith refers, item 26 in the handout, to Plutarch in another place, and that other place is the life of Demosthenes, 5:6, for 1,000 minae being Isocrates' fee for lecturing. And item 26, I read out, it may perhaps be worthwhile to remark that if we accept the poets, a few orators and a few historians, the far greater part of the other eminent men of letters, both of Greece and Rome, appear to have been either public or private teachers, generally either of philosophy or rhetoric. This remark will be found to hold true from the days of Lysias and Isocrates, of Plato and Aristotle, down to those of Plutarch and Epictetus, Suetonius and Quintilian. One doesn't know how far Adam Smith reflected on the teaching role of Plutarch and how well he would have understood the relation between Plutarch's teaching of pupils in philosophy and his writing and political activities of various sorts. I move on, and I apologize for some dislocation in the handout's order, which is there for reasons of layout. I move to my last 18th century giant, a giant of a sort, Gavin Hamilton, best remembered for his hunting for antiquities in the neighborhood of Rome and for stunning discoveries of sculpture at Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. But as well as doing that, he was a mean portrait painter, and indeed that is the career that had taken him to Rome to begin with. He was from a prominent family headed by the Jew Hamilton, which the town of Hamilton in South Lancashire is named. He was educated at the University of Glasgow. I'll come to Glasgow shortly. And he studied painting in Rome in the 1740s. After a brief return home, he did a bit of portrait painting in London, and then went back to Rome in 1756, and there lived for the rest of his life, excavating and selling antiquities, but also still painting. Aside from a few portraits of friends and family and British people on the Grand Tour, he had a preference for painting classical subjects, and I think two of these are very likely to have a Plutarchan link. The first is his Coriolanus, which you will find on page 5 of the handout in a version which was an engraving to illustrate an edition published by Boydell in Cheapside in 1803. But it's possible here that he may have been using Livy rather than Plutarch's Coriolanus to give him ideas. Indeed, he might have been using Shakespeare. But I don't think it can have been Livy to whom he turned for his Cleopatra, finished by 1780, that you have in glorious colour. I'm very grateful to the organisers for allowing me colour on the handout. And I'm sure that the Secretary of the International Plutarch Society will be prepared to run a competition for a caption for this nice painting. Now to my last, and Gavin Hamilton was not my last, but my last 18th century figure, James Boswell, who took an arts course in Edinburgh University from 1753 to 8, and was in the class of Robert Hunter, who is another figure that might, in other circumstances, be said more about. Boswell then went to Glasgow, where he studied from 1759, and one of his professors in Glasgow was Adam Smith. He then converted, however, to Catholicism, became a monk, and enjoyed 3 months of debauchery in London. And I feel that none of this would have happened if he'd been a regular reader of Plutarch. Certainly the right parts of Plutarch. It's not either obvious that Plutarch was a major influence on his later magnum opus, his Life of Samuel Johnson, 1791, even though in the introduction he quotes Plutarch, whom he calls the Prince of Ancient Biographers, to support his own focus on Johnson's conversation, and he quotes the very frequently cited passage from the opening of the Alexander. But whether much of Plutarch's method really percolated is another matter, I think. I'm going to close with a very quick look at what's going on in teaching and universities in the 18th century. I've already mentioned a professor in Edinburgh, Robert Hunter. Another in Edinburgh was called Dalzell. He attended Edinburgh University himself, then became a private tutor, and eventually got the Edinburgh chair in 1779. And in order to assist his teaching, he put together a work of selections from Greek authors, Collectania Graeca Minora, which was first published in 1787. Now, he doesn't totally omit Plutarch. He has a selection of the Apophthegmata, which he's supposed to be by Plutarch. And he gives a reason for not having Plutarch in the second edition. Said in stilo seu ne quaquam assecutus est elegantiam summorum vetrum scriptorum. He didn't have the elegance of the top ancient writers. And this is one reason why Plutarch, I think, moves out of the center of curricula as we move into the 19th century. His Greek wasn't good. It wasn't the sort of Greek that you would want to imitate when you write Greek prose. Going back quickly to a final item in the 18th century, in Glasgow, where we've already encountered Adam Smith as a professor, there were a number of other distinguished figures and distinguished students. And most important amongst the students, perhaps, were Robert and Andrew Fowles, son of Andrew Faulds, and then the name was changed in the 1730s. One of these trained as a barber, which his father had been, but then went to Hutchinson's classes at the university and was encouraged to become a printer and bookseller. The other brother, Andrew, studied humanity, that is Latin, at Glasgow University, and later taught both Greek and Latin there, as well indeed as French. In 1738, these brothers, the Fowles brothers, toured England and France, and had access to libraries there, and started purchasing books, which they exported to Britain and successfully sold in London. In 1741, Fowles established a bookshop in the college in Glasgow and started publishing their own editions, fancy editions. Only two of these, as far as I can see, were Plutarch's. I put them down as numbers 32 and 33 in the handout. 32, you see the Peridicedomenias is included with a number of other works. And then Quomodo adolescens poetes adiri debiat is published rather later in 1753. As a coda, but I'm not going to pursue this tale, I just draw attention in item 35 in the handout to the knowledge that Walter Scott had of Plutarch, which clearly was quite substantial, but Walter Scott would take me out of the 18th and into the 19th century, and I understood that 1800 was the notional limit to which we were allowed to proceed by the organizers. But I know that some 19th century figures will be heard of. This has not been the sort of talk after which any broad or certainly deep conclusions can be formulated. I've given you a tour d'horizon. We don't have enough information, I think, to write a proper history. There may be more information there to be garnered, either by me or more likely by somebody with more energy and life. But I hope that sometime a history of this will be written. Thank you very much.